Okay, in this tutorial, I'm going to explore how to complete the first step of your findings, which involves the processing and presentation of the data that you gathered whilst conducting your fieldwork. Now, the data that you've gathered will be likely to have come primarily in primary data, and that is the data you actually recorded in tables and charts and through surveys when you were out completing your fieldwork. However, many of you may also have parts of your data are secondary data, which you have extracted from some website, whether that's the a census website or the SIMD website or some other source of information, for example, Zoopla, if you're doing a property value survey. So whatever format your data is in, you're now thinking about how do I present it. And I'm showing you the main SQA guidance on this chapter. And the first thing you should notice that it is actually worth 10 marks. You can see that up there. So you're looking to achieve a significant number of your marks, 10 of the 60, just from using a range of techniques. Now, these techniques that you're going to present your data in are going to be across all three research questions. So you're going to be looking to present all of your results in different ways. And because you have three research questions, you're going to be using different techniques. You don't need to use the same technique. As a matter of fact, I would encourage you strongly to use a variety of techniques across your different research questions. And they don't all have to be the typical presentation techniques. There are others, which I'll talk more about in a second. Right. The first thing you actually need to look at is think about how have I gathered that data, and is the way I've gathered my data going to influence the technique I use? So there are some basic rules here that you need to think about. If your data has been gathered across a range of sites or areas, for example, different areas of a town or different streets in a town or different areas of Scotland or different locations, you're going to probably want to map your data or use a base map and put some kind of mapping technique of your data onto that map to allow you to visualize a pattern of variation. And there are lots of different techniques that you can use, and I'll show you the ones that you're likely to think about. But they'll probably include proportional symbol mapping techniques, which is common technique used by many students. You might choose a shading density, or also known as a choropleth mapping technique, which might be appropriate if your data is gathered as an average for areas. Or in some circumstances, you might even be thinking about things like an isopleth map or isoline map, or even indeed a flow map, if appropriate. Now, if your data is where you're trying to compare different sites or amounts, you might also choose to be using some basic graphical technique, like bar graphs, for example, to allow you to compare. And you might even choose to put a graph on a map. And I'll show you some examples of what that looks like. Now, if you're looking to look at two variables and compare them, it's very likely you're going to be using statistics and scatter graphs, because scatter graphs are ideally designed for allowing you to compare and look for correlation between two variables. And clearly, Pearson's tests and Spearman rank tests are the statistical tests that allow you to then test whether there is a relationship. If you're looking for differences between different sites or variables that you've gathered, then it's likely you might want to use a chi-square test. And also both for all data sets, in not just chi-square, but you might be looking for to use a dispersion graph and maybe even go and do an interquartile range and a box whisker graph on that. There are many techniques that you can use. If you're looking for trends across an area, like a line, like a transect, then you're going to possibly want to use some mapping technique, but you might choose for a simpler kite graph or line graph to present your data. So at this point, you're going to need to write down what your data is, what have you got data on, and what are your likely techniques. And that might come through a conversation, but at this point, I would pause the video, consider each research question, write it down on a piece of paper, what my three research questions, what data do I have for each, and can I quite obviously see some techniques I would like to use. Okay, now I'm assuming you've got some basic idea about techniques you might like to use for each of your three. That might require a much deeper conversation with the teacher, or you might have some very clear ideas that jump to mind. The next step is to think about what's the mark scheme. Now, I would suggest you pause and just have a little read through this. And I'll show you about the typical way you want to present your data presentation. But if you're going to target 8 to 10 marks, you're going to have to use a wide range of techniques. So that's different techniques. They have to be valid. Now, what that means is that the technique you choose has got to be appropriate for the data you've gathered. And it's also got to clearly allow you to draw some conclusions. It's got to show off what it is you're wanting to show off that allows you to then make some kind of valid point about what your data is showing. You've also got to then skillfully integrate that technique into your research. You've got to be mindful about, what am I intending to show? What am I writing about here? What am I trying to prove? And I'm obviously going to have to talk about my data presentation. That is a very, not just an important part, that is the most fundamental part of the entire investigation. You've gathered data, you're now presenting your results, which by definition is the most interesting part. So let's have a little look about what that might look like. I've got some basic ideas. Now you can access this document by just clicking into this part of the website, and you can see this at more leisure. I'll come back to these points in a second. But for example, if you have 2 locations or 3 or 4 or 5 locations and you have lots of samples gathered at those locations, those samples could be anything. It doesn't really matter what the sample is, but the samples have got to have some kind of score, and it's got to be a range between your lowest and your highest. You could do a dispersion graph, as you can see here. You could add a box and a whisker, and to do that, you'd need to calculate the interquartile range. Once again, your teacher could show you how to do that if you don't feel confident doing that yourself. That then allows you to compare your 2 or more areas or rivers or slopes or whatever it is you've gathered your data on. Furthermore, you could use this. This is a soil study, but why I've included this is the person has overlaid their data onto an OS map. Now, this is a very powerful technique, adding data, in this case a soil rub, to a Ordnance Survey map, linking the data to the actual location. So these were the soil rubs taken at these locations on this particular part of the hill. And the person has also annotated some additional information. Here we've got the standard scatter graphs used to see if there is a relationship between the X variable, which is the X-axis, in this case the sites visited, and the Y variable, which we can see is different soil characteristics. This is a proportional symbols map that's also been color-coded, which allows the student not to just represent the bigger symbol representing the bigger value, but also the color coding links it to another aspect of the key, which we can see over here. And whilst this is just presenting data on a river, this could also be a very useful technique for presenting data across an area. A very common technique and a very powerful technique is to link a site on a map with a piece of data to an actual photograph. So this location here was taken from here. So this little red circle here is actually visually shown here. And if you make those connections with data you're presenting on maps and directly connect them with photographs that are then annotated, it's far more powerful for the person reading the project to understand the data, especially when it's not just a photo, but it's a photo with confirmed information. So that's just some suggestions. Now, what I would suggest you do as the next step is look at the examples in the Google Classroom. Before I do that, I just want to point you to the student workbook, which will take you a little bit further into how could I present my data. And you'll see in the contents page, if you happen to have done a project from any of these physical topics or human topics, you can actually turn to those pages and have a little look at some examples of how data has been presented. And you might find that you actually have data that's very similar to the ones shown here and might choose to do something very similar. So for example, if we go down to the beach profile, so if you've gathered your data on a beach, you might, here we are, beach profile analysis, choose to present your data, and I'll just show you some examples using the changing gradient as a big line graph so I can see what the beach looks like. I've then matched it with, in this case, some data gathered along those transects. And I've also, this person has then added using Google Earth Graph, proportional bars to each of those transects. Okay. This is also a scatter graph being used to compare one variable with another. And this person was also looking at pH changes on a slope. And then they were not just creating a pH graph to show the changing pH on the transect, but they also have this little map here that links this transect here to this graph. Okay. Now, if you're not interested in, if your project doesn't quite match any of the examples, you want to scroll a little bit further down into this. Just going to scroll deeper and actually have a look at the general techniques. Okay. Here we are. So techniques, bar graphs, and you'll find from this point onwards, from page 53 of this booklet all the way through, there are lots of different standard data presentation techniques, starting with the graphs. These are all techniques that you will have or will be studying in class. And they go then on to, if I just go a little bit further, statistical techniques, and your teacher will discuss an appropriate statistical technique that they would suggest you use, and it's strongly recommended you do try to use one in your project because they get awarded high marks. And finally, if applicable and desirable in some cases, a map to present your data. So here is choropleth mapping, dot maps, isoline maps, and one that's commonly used by students, proportional symbols maps. Okay, so that is the student workbook. Now, at this stage, I would just pause, have a look at that, and flesh out your list that you wrote at the start for each research question. Now that you've maybe had a look through this booklet, and I would strongly recommend it, are there any additional ideas, and could you see how you might choose to use them in the context of one of your research questions? And just add that to your rough notes. Okay, let's go and have a look back at the main area that we were looking at. If we go back to the findings. Now, I did say before I look at some examples, I just want to address this little thing here. So when you're presenting data, there's some kind of real fundamental rules, and I'll show you some examples that are going to illustrate this. You're always going to try to use the most sophisticated rule technique possible. I do not want to see, or nor should I see, a project full of bar graphs, pie charts, and line graphs. That is not sophisticated. You are going to, or should attempt to combine graphs and maps and pictures into one overall piece of presentation. It's a very effective thing to do in geography, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. Take pride in your presentation. Don't make them too small. Always, every piece of presentation has to have a title, so I know what the map, photo, graph, chart is showing. Underneath it, it should always be called figure something. So figure 10, 10.1, 10.2, however you want to sequence it. And by the way, everything that's called figure something then needs to be referred to in your writing. If it's a map, you want to have a scale and a compass. Make sure all your axes are labeled on your graphs, and any photograph you put in must be annotated. Don't just put photos in yourself. Okay. In the next step, you will be analyzing this, and we'll talk more about in your analysis how to approach talking about your data presentation, because of course the analysis and the data presentation are both linked. Okay, I said that finally I would look at some examples. So there are 4 examples in this part of the Google Classroom website. This first one is fantastic because it shows you how it should be laid out. So this student has called it Research Question 1. They've got the title Findings. They've reminded me what the research question is about. They didn't necessarily need the title. That's a little bit too far. But what they have done is they've started with a scatter graph because they're interested in showing how slope gradient was influencing soil moisture. They've also clearly identified some anomalies. These are bits of data that didn't fit the overall pattern. What they've gone on and done is given me some photographs of those anomalies, of those sites where the data didn't fit the pattern, and they've given me some annotations to explain why they didn't. Okay. Now, if they were analyzing it, they would obviously be telling me what this data shows and what the anomalies show, and if there is indeed a relationship between slope gradient and soil moisture. They could also, if they so choose, and they do so down here, go on to conduct a statistical test, and they've done a Pearson test to test whether there is a relationship between the slope gradient and the soil moisture, and their result showed that there was a negative relationship and that actually they were able to reject the null with a 99% of certainty. So what we can see is 3 techniques here: a scatter graph, photos that are linked to the scatter graph, and then to test the relationship, a statistical test. So 3 techniques, all sophisticated, have been used in this research question. Research question 2 is putting a bar graph, which is basically what this is, onto an aerial photograph, Google Earth. Now, this is using the Google Earth Graph software. And they've combined that with the actual lines. So here we can see one of the transects called transect 1, and the 10 sites, and the number of plant species. And this transect 1 is this one here, and we can see that same data but this time being presented on its actual slope that it was on. So these bars are actually directly linked and are using the same data as this line. And we can see there's the 4 graphs and the 4 transects. So that's a really nice little piece of data presentation by this student. Example number 2, and just to illustrate a point I made earlier, this has a title, it's called Figure 19, and the axis is called depth in meters. And we've got the student using a dispersion graph to compare two rivers, and we've already looked at that. Here they use standard deviation to see, which is a statistical test that you might have encountered already, to see the spread of the data. It's a predictive technique, and they draw some conclusions about that. They've also linked, because this is a river, they've linked these two rivers with an overall cross profile of the river. So they've got 3 techniques. Once again, and the long profile of the river, which is from source to mouth. That's 4 techniques, all rolled into one research question. So you can see they're not just relying on one basic technique for one research question. Right, if we have a look at example number 3, this student is looking at agriculture and soil on slopes, and they've used proportional symbols down a slope. They've chosen appropriate color to match the idea of soil, and we can see that this value is the highest. They've also annotated this map with some additional information, which is a very powerful way of communicating. They should have called this figure something, and they should have had a title. So that's a little miss that this student made. They have then gone on to link this data, each of these, with the land uses that the soil was taken from. So the color coding for each of the bars represents the land use. And I can see sites 1 to 25 match this 1 to 25 down the slope. So it's the same data being used, but just being shown in a different way. Okay. And they've done that furthermore with another aspect of the soil. And our final example that I want to talk through, this student is looking at property values across an urban area and factors that influence them. We can see that from the research question. There's the title. They probably should have had a small little introduction here and then started talking about these different property areas. They're clearly giving us a very strong visual account of the areas. And these 4 figures, annotated photos, are then discussed in this very detailed map. So this is a map plotting all of the average prices across the whole of the area being studied. They've got all of their analysis is being done through these complex labels that we can see here. And 4 of those sites were actually linked to these 4 photos. So I'm able to connect some of these circles with real places. What you'll also notice is this is a map that's taken up a whole A4 page, which is quite powerful. And then they're looking for a variation in terms of the average price and the average environmental quality of the different areas. So they're doing a scatter graph. This is a second research question. And then they've done a statistical test to see if there was a relationship, and they got a 95% certainty using the Pearson's test. And then they just gave an example of one of their sites, calling it Figure 17. This is one of their sites where they're clearly showing that a nice environmental quality was linked to a high property value. And they've done that with areas with low environmental quality and low property values. So this is where annotated photos should always be put in and sit alongside all of the other bits of data presentation, because each of these little dots or circles on this map are actually represented by real places through an annotated photo. Okay, spend some time, replay this video a few times, have a look at the resources in the Google Classroom, have a look at the sample projects to see what you're doing. But the top tip here is for each research question, have a very clear idea about, at least I would recommend 2 different data presentation techniques for each of your research questions, as well as a series of annotated photos in each of them. And finally, think about which of the 3 might be suited to doing a statistical test to test something about your data.